The old king was dying. David, the man who had faced giants, vanquished armies, and united a kingdom, now lay in his bed, frail as a candle about to go out. But if the flame of his life flickered, the fire of ambition burned fiercely in the halls of the palace. Adonijah, his eldest surviving son, already saw himself crowned. He surrounded himself with allies, gathered the most powerful, and prepared a banquet to celebrate what he considered inevitable, his coronation. He did not ask permission. He did not consult his father. He simply took for himself what he believed was rightfully his. But inside the palace, where the shadows held secrets and the walls whispered conspiracies, another story was being written. Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, would not accept that her son be cast aside, and Nathan, the prophet who had defied kings before, knew it was time to act. Together, they hatched a plan. Bathsheba entered first. Her gaze, sharp as a blade, fell upon the weakened king. She stepped closer and, in a voice filled with urgency, reminded him of his promise: Solomon must reign. Nathan came soon after, confirming every word, reinforcing the danger that loomed if Adonijah took the throne. And then, in that moment of weakness, David did what he had always done in his glory days. He made a decision. Solomon would be king. The announcement came like a thunderclap on the horizon. While Adonijah and his allies toasted an early victory, the news spread like wildfire. Solomon had been crowned. The coup was instantaneous. Fear gripped the traitors. Adonijah's banquet became a bitter meal. But what would a young king do when he took a throne surrounded by enemies, ambitions, and unfulfilled promises? What would a ruler who had the whole world before him ask for? Wealth, glory, revenge? Solomon, on his knees, raised his eyes to the sky and asked for only one thing: wisdom. And that was when his true story began. The silence in the courtroom was piercing. Two women, their faces marked by exhaustion and despair, stood before the king. In the arms of one of them, a baby cried softly. "He is mine!" the first screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Liar! This child is mine!" The second replied, her voice trembling with fury. All eyes turned to Solomon. He observed them both, not in a hurry, not impatiently, but with a gaze that seemed to pierce flesh and see into souls. The story was simple, and, at the same time, an impossible knot to untie. Both had given birth, but one of the babies had died during the night. Now, both were crying out for their living child. There were no witnesses, there was no evidence, only the word of one against the other. The room awaited a verdict. One mistake by the king, and justice would be tarnished. One hesitation, and his authority would crumble. But Solomon was no ordinary king. He leaned back in his throne, took a deep breath, and said, "Bring me a sword." A murmur filled the room. What did he intend? The sword was brought, gleaming in the torchlight. The king took it, held it high, and declared coldly, "Cut the baby in half. Give half to each of you." The entire court held its breath. The steel of judgment hung over the defenseless child. The first woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with horror. "No, for God's sake, don't kill him. Let her have him, but please let him live." The second woman, however, crossed her arms and said without emotion, "So be it. If he can't be mine, let him be no one's." Silence. A silence as heavy as lead. Solomon lowered his sword and smiled, not with joy, but with the weight of what he had known all along. He pointed to the first woman. "This is the true heart of a mother. Give her the child." The courtroom erupted in gasps of astonishment. The news spread through the alleys, through the marketplaces, through the palace corridors. The king of Israel was not only powerful, he saw beyond words, beyond lies, beyond shadows. And so Solomon won not only a kingdom, but the trust of his people. His wisdom became a legend. But the higher a man climbs, the heavier the crown becomes. And if a trial can reveal the truth of a heart, what can reveal the weight of power upon the one who bears it? The first rays of sunlight were bathing Jerusalem as the thunder of hammers echoed through the city. The dust of freshly cut stone danced in the air, mingling with the scent of cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon. The time had come. The temple of the Lord would be built, and Solomon, the king of wisdom, would make his eternal mark on history. But greatness comes at a price. Since the days of David, the desire to build a house for God had burned in the hearts of the faithful. But this was no ordinary project. It required precious materials, tireless workers, and above all, sacrifice. And Solomon was determined to make it a reflection of heaven's glory. Pure gold covered the walls, giant pillars supported the roof, curtains dyed purple, blue, and crimson separated the sacred from the profane. The Ark of the Covenant would rest there, protected in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place on earth. But not everything shone like the gold on the temple walls. To build such a monument, the king imposed heavy taxes. Men were taken from their homes, conscripted to work on the construction. For years, they cut stone, carved wood, shaped metal. The effort was colossal, the vision grand, but the murmurs grew louder. The weight of taxes weighed down the people's shoulders, and smiles of adoration mixed with the exhaustion of those who bore the burden. Foreign ambassadors came and went, marveling at the opulence of the project. Solomon's name already crossed deserts and seas, echoing in distant lands. And the more riches flowed to Israel, the more the eyes of the world turned to his throne. And then one day, among the caravans of gold, spices, and precious stones, someone arrived who brought not only gifts, but questions. A woman with a sharp wit and eyes that seemed to read the soul. The Queen of Sheba had arrived. The gates of Jerusalem opened to a procession unlike any other, camels adorned with luxurious fabrics, laden with gold, rare spices, and precious stones. Servants marched in perfect unison, each bearing a gift worthy of a king. But no treasure shone brighter than the woman's eyes. The Queen of Sheba had traveled from distant lands, driven not only by curiosity, but by the promise of a mystery. Was Solomon really as wise as they said? She had not come merely to observe, she had come to test. In the palace halls, amidst carved columns and tables laden with exotic delicacies, the queen had posed riddles and challenges, each one more cunning than the last. And Solomon, without hesitation, answered each one as if he had already known the questions before they were even asked. She had seen the gold glittering in the halls, the thrones carved with impossible detail, the gardens where water gushed from marble fountains. She had observed the servants, their attire, their impeccable organization. No detail had escaped her. And in the end, when there was no longer any doubt, she sighed and admitted, "Everything I heard about you was true, but not even half of it was told to me." Israel's wealth grew even more with that visit. Trade agreements expanded. Caravans began to cross the desert, bringing goods from faraway lands. Solomon's name now echoed like a legend among the people. But where there is gold, there is greed, and where there is power, there is weakness. Among the treasures, there was also something more dangerous than precious metals: alliances. Women from different kingdoms, united to the king through political marriages, each brought with her her culture, her customs, and her gods. And so it was that, little by little, something began to rise within the king's own heart, not a temple, but a hidden altar, made of silent concessions and small permissions. The wise king, who had once asked God for discernment, now found himself surrounded by voices whispering temptations. High above Jerusalem, the temple of the Lord shone like a heavenly jewel. But in the shadows, other altars stood, silent, discreet, hidden by the dust of years and the promises of alliances. Solomon did not realize when it all began. Perhaps it was with a single concession, a small, almost insignificant gesture. An altar to Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, at the request of a wife, then another to Milcom, the idol of the Ammonites. They were only symbols, they said, signs of political goodwill. But symbols have power, and the king's heart, once unshakable, now wavered between two loyalties. His marriages were many, 700 wives, 300 concubines. Alliances sealed not only with rings, but with habits and influences that little by little weakened the oath he had made to the one God of Israel. The man who had once asked for wisdom now allowed himself to be distracted by sweet voices, by promises whispered at dusk, by odes to foreign gods. The people who had once revered him as a just and pious king were beginning to grow restless. Gold was flowing, but not for everyone. Forced labor was on the rise. Taxes were rising. Murmurings were turning into whispers of discontent. The glitter of the crown hid fissures that spread like cracks in a crumbling wall. And then came the warning. The prophet entered the palace halls, his face hard as stone. His voice, sharp as a blade, echoed across the golden throne. Because your heart has turned away, the kingdom will be torn from you. The gold, the women, the altars. None of these could protect him from a prophecy. Nothing would prevent what was coming. And beyond the palace walls, in the bustling streets and the sun-baked fields, a name was beginning to be whispered. A name that would bring a storm: Jeroboam. Solomon's throne was still made of gold, but its support was beginning to crumble. The king who had once enchanted nations with his wisdom now ruled under the weight of his own decay. The people, once captivated by his justice, now murmured in the streets. Taxes were rising, forced laborers groaned under the weight of great buildings, and the shadows of foreign gods hung over Jerusalem. Discontent spread like wildfire. The northern tribes no longer saw Solomon as their chosen king, but as a distant tyrant. His officials were hated, his tax collectors were feared, and among Israel's servants and warriors, one name kept cropping up: Jeroboam. He was no ordinary man. Shrewd, ambitious, and charismatic, Jeroboam won the loyalty of the discontented. His leadership of the king's forced labor earned him something Solomon had lost: the respect of the people. He was not a son of David, not of royal lineage, but there was something about him that made men follow him. And then the prophet Ahijah appeared before him. In an open field far from the palace walls, the man of God tore his own robe into 12 pieces and gave 10 into Jeroboam's hands. "So shall it be, Israel," he said. "The kingdom shall be divided. 10 tribes shall be yours." The warning was clear. God's wrath upon Solomon would not be long in coming. The news spread like distant thunder before the storm. Solomon heard of the prophecy, and for the first time in his life, the wise king made an unthinking decision. He ordered Jeroboam's death, but the young warrior fled. He set out for Egypt, where he would find refuge and wait. Time was his ally. The prophecy was not a threat, it was a promise. And as Jeroboam departed, Solomon himself, now old and tormented, felt the weight of his own mistakes. His enemies were growing inside and outside the kingdom. Edomites and Syrians, once submissive, were now rebelling. The king who had brought peace to Israel now found his nation on the brink of civil war. And then, in a silent palace surrounded by riches that no longer meant anything, the wisest man in the world realized his wisdom had not saved him, but time was not standing still. The wheel of history continued to turn, and with Solomon's death, all that had been built would face its greatest test. The throne now belonged to his son. The palace bells rang out in mournful tones. The king was dead. In the streets of Jerusalem, the murmur of the people was a mixture of respect and relief. Solomon, the wise, the magnificent, the king of gold and splendor, was gone. But what had he left behind? The imposing Temple of Jerusalem shone like an eternal promise. Its bronze gates, the golden cherubim, the sacred altar, all these were supposed to be the symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. But was that covenant still intact? The riches were innumerable. The thrones, the walls, the palaces built by the king formed a city like no other. Trade flourished, the nations still honored the name of Israel, and the weight of the crown now rested on the head of his son Rehoboam. But along with the glory, Solomon had also left unseen cracks. The people were tired. The taxes exacted to feed the king's luxury had become a crushing burden. The forced laborers who had built the grandiose buildings now wanted rest. The priests looked with disgust on the foreign altars that still polluted the promised land, and far away, in the shadows of exile, Jeroboam waited. The late king's counselors gathered with Rehoboam. The crowd clamored for relief. "Your father laid a heavy yoke upon us," they said. "Lighten the burden, and we will serve you." Rehoboam looked to the elders, the men who had served his father. They gave him wise advice. "If you will be a servant to the people today, they will serve you forever." But the young king hesitated. There was another voice. His friends, young like him, raised in the opulence of the palace, laughed at the idea. "Show your strength. Tell them that if your father punished them with whips, you will punish them with scorpions." The decision was made. The new king stood before the people, and his voice echoed through the squares of Jerusalem. "My father has laid a heavy yoke upon you. I will make it even heavier." The silence that followed his words was not a silence of respect. It was the silence of revolt about to explode. And amid the crowd, a name was spoken again, a name that grew like a storm on the horizon. Jeroboam was back. The fate of kings is not forged in battles alone, but in the silent decisions that shape empires. Solomon had begun his journey as a wise man, a king who sought God's guidance above all else. But the line between wisdom and vanity is thin, and the glitter of gold often blinds even the most discerning eyes. Discontent spread like wildfire. The northern tribes no longer saw Solomon as their chosen king, but as a distant tyrant. His officials were hated, his tax collectors were feared, and among Israel's servants and warriors, one name kept cropping up: Jeroboam. He was no ordinary man. Shrewd, ambitious, and charismatic, Jeroboam won the loyalty of the discontented. His leadership of the king's forced labor earned him something Solomon had lost: the respect of the people. He was not a son of David, not of royal lineage, but there was something about him that made men follow him. And then the prophet Ahijah appeared before him. In an open field, far from the palace walls, the man of God tore his own robe into 12 pieces and gave 10 into Jeroboam's hands. "So shall it be, Israel," he said. "The kingdom shall be divided. 10 tribes shall be yours." The warning was clear. God's wrath upon Solomon would not be long in coming. The news spread like distant thunder before the storm. Solomon heard of the prophecy, and for the first time in his life, the wise king made an unthinking decision. He ordered Jeroboam's death, but the young warrior fled. He set out for Egypt, where he would find refuge and wait. Time was his ally. The prophecy was not a threat, it was a promise. And as Jeroboam departed, Solomon himself, now old and tormented, felt the weight of his own mistakes. His enemies were growing inside and outside the kingdom. Edomites and Syrians, once submissive, were now rebelling. The king who had brought peace to Israel now found his nation on the brink of civil war. And then, in a silent palace, surrounded by riches that no longer meant anything, the wisest man in the world realized his wisdom had not saved him. But time was not standing still. The wheel of history continued to turn, and with Solomon's death, all that had been built would face its greatest test. The throne now belonged to his son. The palace bells rang out in mournful tones. The king was dead. In the streets of Jerusalem, the murmur of the people was a mixture of respect and relief. Solomon, the wise, the magnificent, the king of gold and splendor, was gone. But what had he left behind? The imposing temple of Jerusalem shone like an eternal promise. Its bronze gates, the golden cherubim, the sacred altar, all these were supposed to be the symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. But was that covenant still intact? The riches were innumerable. The thrones, the walls, the palaces built by the king formed a city like no other. Trade flourished. The nation still honored the name of Israel, and the weight of the crown now rested on the head of his son, Rehoboam. But along with the glory, Solomon had also left unseen cracks. The people were tired. The taxes exacted to feed the king's luxury had become a crushing burden. The forced laborers who had built the grandiose buildings now wanted rest. The priests looked with disgust on the foreign altars that still polluted the promised land. And far away, in the shadows of exile, Jeroboam waited. The late king's counselors gathered with Rehoboam. The crowd clamored for relief. "Your father laid a heavy yoke upon us," they said. "Lighten the burden, and we will serve you." Rehoboam looked to the elders, the men who had served his father. They gave him wise advice. "If you will be a servant to the people today, they will serve you forever." But the young king hesitated. There was another voice. His friends, young like him, raised in the opulence of the palace, laughed at the idea. "Show your strength. Tell them that if your father punished them with whips, you will punish them with scorpions." The decision was made. The new king stood before the people, and his voice echoed through the squares of Jerusalem. "My father has laid a heavy yoke upon you. I will make it even heavier." The silence that followed his words was not a silence of respect. It was the silence of revolt about to explode. And amid the crowd, a name was spoken again, a name that grew like a storm on the horizon. Jeroboam was back. The fate of kings is not forged in battles alone, but in the silent decisions that shape empires. Solomon had begun his journey as a wise man, a king who sought God's guidance above all else. But the line between wisdom and vanity is thin, and the glitter of gold often blinds even the most discerning eyes. The young monarch who once asked for wisdom to rule ended up becoming a victim of his own greatness. His wisdom brought glory but also arrogance. His power built an empire but alienated it from the people. The king who built the greatest temple to the God of Israel also allowed false gods to infiltrate its walls. And so the eternal battle between faith and temptation arises. Solomon knew the right path, but the desires of the human heart are treacherous. How many kings had fallen before him? How many more would fall after him? The price of wisdom is constant vigilance, and the wisest king in the world failed to protect what mattered most, his faithfulness to the Lord. In the end, his story became a mirror for those who came after. Rehoboam, his son, now faced the same dilemma: to rule with justice or to reign by fear, to be a servant of the people or a tyrant over them. The weight of the throne was not just gold and jewels, but a burden of choices that would shape generations. And on the other side of that scale, Jeroboam waited. He had been chosen for a purpose. But when destiny called, would he prove himself differently, or would the cycle of ambition and downfall continue? When Solomon ascended the throne, the kingdom of Israel became a place where symbols of power and devotion intertwined. But the most significant of all symbols was the temple in Jerusalem. There stood not just a building of stone, but a living monument to God's promise. Its pillars as tall as mountains, its gates of gleaming gold, were more than physical structures. They were a reflection of what Israel stood for, the chosen people, the guardians of God's covenant. Every stone in the temple was marked with the weight of an oath. It was not just a place of worship, but the center of the spiritual world, where heaven touched earth. The temple was not only where God lived, but where the King of Israel was to humble himself, placing his wisdom and power in the service of the Creator. Yet what was sanctified in the heights became profane in the shadows, as the king's vanity overrode his mission. Solomon's throne shone as a symbol of absolute power. Draped in scarlet velvet and gold, it was the seat of a ruler who believed himself to be close to the gods. But for Solomon, the throne also represented the weight of decision. Each time he sat there, he was not just a king ruling over a people, but one who knew that his choices would echo through the generations. The throne, with its ornaments and symbols of authority, was both a blessing and a curse. And then there was the sword. It was not just a sharp blade. It was the symbol of judgment and justice, the line between right and wrong. Solomon the wise man used his sword at crucial moments, such as the famous trial between two women. But this sword was also a reminder that no matter how much wisdom a king possesses, the power to decide is also the power to make mistakes. These three symbols, the temple, the throne, the sword, were the foundation of his greatness. But in the quiet of the palace, as the gold and charms of the foreign world began to call, the scales of justice and wisdom began to tip. And who else could accurately measure the weight of each decision Solomon made? The price of a choice was already being paid, and the history of Israel was beginning to change. Solomon, the wisest king the world has ever known, was made not only of his intelligence, but also of the men and women who surrounded him. Each played a crucial role in the tapestry of his reign, a web of ambition, wisdom, love, and betrayal, in which the threads of destiny were intertwined. Bathsheba, his mother, was the woman who, even as a figure of pain and loss, had guided her son to the throne. Her wisdom lay not in her words, but in the unconditional love she offered Solomon, and in the secret support she gave him at the moment of his accession to the throne. When the young prince was about to be usurped by Adonijah, Bathsheba knew that the only way to ensure her son's succession was to intervene directly. She was not only a mother, but a shrewd and powerful advisor with the heart of a lioness, fighting for the future of the kingdom. Nathan the prophet stood like a shadow beside Solomon. He was not afraid to tell the king what no one else dared, that his wisdom was no guarantee of purity. When Solomon began to waver, leading Israel into the worship of foreign gods, Nathan became the tireless voice of truth. A prophet of courage, he never hesitated to remind the king of his responsibility before God. It was through Nathan that God's truth, unrelenting and direct, reached the king's heart. And then there was the Queen of Sheba, mysterious, powerful, exotic. She was the very symbol of what Solomon's reign represented, an empire that attracted the world, a kingdom that dazzled with its wisdom and riches. Her visit was not just a meeting of kingdoms, but of minds. When she arrived in Jerusalem, she brought with her more than lavish gifts and rare spices. She brought questions, challenging Solomon's wisdom. But in the end, both of them recognized each other as equals in their intellect and discernment. To her, Solomon was not just a king, he was a legend, and she was willing to learn. And amid all this splendor, Jeroboam stood as the invisible but growing force lurking in the shadows. The son of a servant, but with the heart of a warrior, he began to be the mirror of Solomon's failings. In every decision the king made, in every display of power, Jeroboam saw his own path taking shape. He was no mere rebel, but the reflection of all that Israel could become when pride took hold of a king's heart. Solomon ruled by wisdom, but Jeroboam believed that destiny defied itself, that he himself could shape the future. These characters, Bathsheba, Nathan, the Queen of Sheba, Jeroboam, were the key pieces on Solomon's chessboard. Each one, with his own vision of the world, with his own ambitions, generated the tension that defined the history of a reign. And now, with Solomon out of the picture, the impact of his choices would be reflected in Rehoboam's steps. But what would he do when faced with the legacies of his lineage? When Solomon asked God for wisdom, he did not know that he was asking for something that would require more than his intelligence. It would require sacrifice. The wisdom he sought so much was not a quiet gift. It was loaded with an immense responsibility, an invisible weight that could not be avoided. True wisdom does not translate into easy answers, but into understanding that behind every decision there are consequences that reverberate beyond the horizon of the reign. And it was at this point that Solomon began to lose his way. As his wisdom elevated him, his ability to discern right from wrong became increasingly blurred. Wisdom, when mismanaged, is not only a blessing, it becomes a sharp weapon that cuts both the king and those he loves. And the cost is always high. The king who ruled with the discernment of 1,000 hearts was also the king who, blinded by his own intellect, ignored the warnings that arose around him. His alliances with foreign wives and his tolerance of idolatry were not just errors of judgment. They were deep moral failings that corroded the foundations of his own wisdom. Power, in turn, corrupts in subtle ways. At first, Solomon ruled with the intention of promoting justice, but soon he began to see power as a right rather than a responsibility. He who had so long seemed above the temptations of the earth eventually succumbed to the allurements of wealth and greatness. A reign that began in humility and wisdom met its end at the hands of a man who believed that his dominion over the nations made him invulnerable. True corruption does not occur only when one acts wrongly. It begins when one loses sight of the purpose for which one was placed there. And what of the corruption that has crept into the kingdom? The opulence of Jerusalem belied the signs of decline. When Solomon built the temple, the nation was united under a single faith. But as the years passed, the worship of foreign gods began to creep in among the Israelites. And what seemed like a minor deviation became a fissure that split the heart of Israel, threatening everything the king had built. The corruption of faith mirrored the corruption of power. When the king loses control of his own morality, the people lose theirs too. Now, with Rehoboam taking the throne and the empire splintering, the line between what is just and what is politically advantageous begins to blur even further. The next generation will face the ghosts of the past, dealing with a legacy of decisions that will weigh heavily on their heads. Solomon may have been the wisest man on earth, but the dilemmas he faced are the same ones all rulers face. How do you keep your soul pure when power threatens to consume it? And amidst all this tension, Jeroboam watched, waiting for his chance. The great temple that Solomon had built, a symbol of Israel's strength and greatness, now echoed with the sound of conflict and division. What had begun as a united, prosperous, and wise kingdom was on the verge of falling apart. Solomon, the man who had had it all, now faced the price of his choices, a fractured kingdom divided between north and south, and sons who inherit more than just a crown. They inherit the scars of an empire. His son Rehoboam finds himself at the head of a people who see him not as their savior, but as the symbol of his father's failure. The people, tired of the heavy taxes and oppression that followed their rise to wealth, are unwilling to accept the old regime. Solomon, for all his wisdom, could not prevent the imbalance between power and compassion from dethroning his son before he could even earn their respect. Solomon's hand, which had sustained his kingdom with justice and wisdom, now lies cold in the ashes of the greatness he had built. But Solomon's legacy is not measured solely by the riches he accumulated or the temple he built. His true legacy is more subtle, a legacy of reflection. Was the price of wisdom the abandonment of morality? Solomon wanted more than all the other kings, but what did he get in return? The wisdom that had made him great had also been the reason for his downfall, and he knew it. The power he wielded was not just a gift, it was both a cure and a curse. What Solomon could not have foreseen was that the greatest challenge was not ruling an empire, but ruling himself. Jeroboam, watching from afar, understands Solomon's lessons. He understands that having power is not enough. You have to know what to do with it. He sees the wise king, but he also sees the man who failed to keep his faith intact. Now the fate of Israel is in his hands. The choices he makes, the paths he follows, will shape the future of the kingdom, and as the thunder of division echoed across the land, the great temple stood, a reminder that in life, what is built with the hands can be destroyed by the heart. And so Solomon's reign came to an end, and with it the empire that had been forged by wisdom and opulence. But more than the gold and the great temple, Solomon's legacy lives on in the unspoken lessons, in the mistakes and consequences of a man who sought to rule the world but forgot to rule himself. The price of wisdom, the cost of power, and the choices that define not only kingdoms but lives continue to reverberate through the centuries. Now what remains of Solomon is not the splendor of Jerusalem, but the echo of its history. which reminds us that not all wisdom can save a soul that loses its way on the path of pride. Solomon's story is the story of all of us, the constant struggle between what we are and what we could be, between what we build and what we let be destroyed. And the question remains, what will be the legacy you will leave? What will your choices say about you, about your wisdom and your power? If this journey through Solomon's story touched you, be sure to follow our channel to continue exploring the mysteries, lessons, and legacies that the great men and women of the Bible have to teach us. Don't miss the next chapters of our saga, because the story is just beginning. Like, share, and subscribe, because together we will unveil the most profound and transformative things in the kingdom of Scripture.